Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us this morning for NENA, the New Economy Network Australia's very special session with the always fabulous Richard Dennis from the Australia Institute. Before we kick off and invite Richard to give us his rundown on the federal budget, I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Michelle Maloney. I'm one of the co-founders and managers of the New Economy Network Australia. Today, I'm speaking to you from the unceded lands of the Yagara Turrbal people here in beautiful North Brisbane. I invite you all to acknowledge country in the little chat if you wish. I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, to any Indigenous folks joining us today, welcome. And also acknowledge that NENA's work and much of the other work that I'm personally involved in, we're really committed to the whole notion of not just acknowledging country, but acknowledging the ongoing impacts of colonisation to this nation, modern nation, and the work that we all have to do together to build a better future for Australia. And on that note, it'll be wonderful to see more folks joining us for our NENA short course, which kicks off in a couple of weeks. You'll see the unashamed advertising behind my head, Building a Wellbeing Economy, Foundations for Learning and Practice. For anyone who's interested, you can find more info on our website, neweconomy.org.au. But that's enough from me for now. Just a reminder, if you'd like to ask questions to Richard later in our session, please jot them into the chat anytime. I will be plucking them out by order of appearance, and we'll be having a good old discussion. Richard is actually able to join us until about 10 to 1. Due to the change in daylight savings, there were some changes to his schedule, but I'm really delighted that we've got Richard here with us. So, Richard Dennis from the Australia Institute, how are you today?
I'm very well. Thanks for having me along.
Absolutely wonderful. We've invited you, Richard, to give us a nice overview of what the federal budget's been doing. And I'm really happy for you to chat without any further interruptions from me for 20 or 30 minutes, whatever you feel like. And then we'll open up for questions. So thank you so much, Richard. Over to you.
Oh, thank you. And yes, for an economist, it's always exciting to be asked to come and talk to people about the Commonwealth Budget. It's rare to see that there's anyone in the audience for that. So to all those out there today, thanks for having me. And yeah, there'll be plenty of time for questions at the end. I'm going to start with very big picture, like what is the Commonwealth Budget? And then I'll kind of talk about what the point of it is. And then I'll talk about some of the things that are in it. And then, as I said, there'll be plenty of time for questions about what it could do or what does it really mean and all that sort of stuff. So big picture, what we had this week was the Commonwealth Budget. Now, of course, we live in the Commonwealth of Australia. It's made up of all the states and territories, and there's the Commonwealth. And the Commonwealth government had its budget this week. Now, last week. It brought that budget forward because an election will be called sometime in the next 2 to 7 days. And that election will be towards the end of May. We usually have budget around May, but we can kind of have it whenever we want. That's up to the government of the day. So the Commonwealth budget does a few things at the same time. What we see of it, the theatre of the budget, is in some way analogous to what in the US they call the State of the Union address. So once a year in America, the American president gives this State of the Union address and kind of talks about everything that's happening in the country and the direction of the country and, what they want to do. And there's a lot of theatre around the State of the Union address. And in Australia, I hate to say it, pathetic, insecure Australia, we don't have a State of the Union address, we have a budget speech. And it's a speech given by the Treasurer, not the Prime Minister. And in some ways, it kind of suggests that the most important thing in the country is what we're spending money on. And don't get me wrong, what we spend money on matters a lot, but it's no State of the Union. We just talk about this one part of our society, the economy. We just talk about that. We put it on a pedestal. We put the Treasurer on a pedestal. So big picture, it's this big kind of political moment for each government each year to say, look at all the things we're doing, vote for us, we'll make the economy strong. But there's nothing analogous. We never have a speech that's in any way as significant about our society, about our environment, about our foreign policy. You know, it's the economy is the big deal in the budget, and everything else by definition is lower down the ladder than that. Personally, I don't think that's how it should be, but you know, I'm fond of saying who we elect determines the problems we solve. We keep electing people who want to prioritise certain kinds of problems, and you know, they're constitutionally elected, so frustrating as it is, I'll go along with that. So that's what the Commonwealth budget kind of is. Constitutionally, the budget performs a very important function, and that is that the government of the day, in order to spend money on health or spend money on education or spend money subsidising fossil fuels or whatever its priority is, in order to do that, the government has to get the approval of the parliament, so all of the parliament, which means a majority of the lower house has to support it and a majority of the upper house has to support it. And the actual kind of central constitutionally important part of the budget is something called the Appropriations Bills. And the Treasurer of the day puts forward these bills, you know, which are public documents. That's what people spend a bit of time reading on budget day. And the Appropriations Bills, there's a hint in the name, they seek to appropriate funding from something called consolidated revenue. They appropriate funding for particular purposes. So the health minister can't just decide to spend some money on health. The parliament actually has to grant the health minister the authority to spend more money on health. The resources minister can't just give a lot of money to the mining industry to subsidise their exploration. The government has to seek the approval of Parliament through the appropriations bills for that to occur. So, big picture, the Commonwealth budget performs a high-level political function, but it actually performs a very high-level constitutional function, and that is that all of the expenditures of the government of the day need to be approved by Parliament, and the budget is the main time that those approvals are made. The government can come back at any time and seek approval to do something else, but the budget is where most of the appropriations for all the big ticket items are. Now, as a consequence of that, what the budget does, and now this is kind of getting to the important bit, is it reveals literally what the priorities of the government are. And I'm always quite cynical, skeptical about the use of the word priority. Politicians assure every group they're talking to that every issue they've ever confronted is a priority. Well, it's not. A priority is something you put ahead of something else. So to prioritise anything, you have to deprioritise something. Otherwise, you haven't actually prioritised it. So when, you know, think about an emergency ward at a crowded hospital on a Saturday night, we can't tell everybody that they're a priority. The people that are closest to death are prioritised. And that means the people who've badly broken their leg and are just in a lot of pain, they have to wait longer. Like actual priorities from an economic point of view, the word has a very clear meaning. To prioritise something means to treat it more advantageously than something else. But politicians don't like to admit that. Politicians want to say aged care is a priority, healthcare is a priority, and paying down the debt is a priority. We have to balance all these things. Well, no, that's not what a budget does at all. It doesn't balance all these things. It reveals what the priorities of the government of the day are. So budgets are actually very important, not just because in a democracy, constitutionally they're required for a government to actually to get those budget bills passed so they can spend money on their priorities, but also it's the only time of the year you can actually look at something and figure out what are the priorities of this government. What are they spending lots of money on? What aren't they spending lots of money on? Now, in a democracy, we can all agree and disagree on what those priorities should be, but at least the budget papers gives us somewhere pretty honest that we can we can rank things. So what do we know that this government's priorities are? Well, obviously, one of the key priorities for this government in this budget was to give tax breaks, short-term tax offsets, can go into the difference if you want, to a whole bunch of people just before the election. So quick, here's some money, I feel your pain. A big, expensive reduction in fuel excise, 20 cents a litre, less tax being collected on petrol. So if you think of all the economics suggesting we should be taxing fossil fuels more, understand that we just agreed to tax them less. Short-term tax handouts pre-election, short-term, literally the legislation only goes for 6 months, cut in fuel excise. They were two of the big centerpieces of the budget. Another big central thing was a big promise to spend a lot more money on defence. Now, this is slightly trickier because most of the increase in defence the government committed to was committed to way off in the future. So if you read the budget papers, you get what happened last year, what's planned to happen this year, and then we see an extra 3 years of forecasts of what comes next. So a lot of the description happens over what's called the 4-year budget period, actual this year +3. But a lot of the defence spending that was announced in the budget paper, in the budget speech, a lot of that can't be found in any of the appropriation bills, because really the government was just saying, we vaguely plan to spend a lot more money on defence at some point in the future, but the appropriation bills that they're putting to Parliament don't actually have that big increase that's promised for defence. Now, don't get me wrong, Australia is already one of the most militarised countries in the world. We spend a very large percentage of GDP on defence, not nearly as much as the US, no one does. But to give you some context, Australia spends more on defence than all of its neighbours. Not just our Pacific neighbours, but even our Asian neighbours. Australia spends more on the military. I call it the military, not defence, because most of our weapons are designed to attack, not defend. We spend more on that than all of our neighbours combined. And to give you a sense again of our priorities as a nation, Australia's got about 25 million people. Taiwan has got about 23 million people, so a little bit smaller than us. Taiwan's 200 miles from mainland China. China makes overt territorial claims to Taiwan. They say, look, actually, we think Taiwan is part of China. So Taiwan's a similar sized country to Australia, much closer to China than us. China makes much more aggressive statements about Taiwan than it does about Australia. And Australia spends more on defence or more on its military than Taiwan. All right, so Australia, 6,000 miles away, we spend more on our military than Taiwan does, and surveys of people in Taiwan suggest that people in Taiwan are less afraid of China invading Taiwan than Australians are. So it's not even like us prioritising all this military spending has made Australians feel safe. Now, a cynic like me might argue the point of the military spending is to make us feel afraid, not safe. But again, the budget papers are the place to go to if you want to know kind of what our priorities are. You might think that Australia spends a lot of money on unemployment benefits. It doesn't. Australia spends far more on the age pension than it spends on unemployment benefits. But typically governments, particularly conservative governments, like to kind of criticise certain categories of welfare recipients as for again, purely political motives. It's a way to say the majority of people who aren't on unemployment benefits, my conservative government is on your side. I want to make sure your money's not wasted on lazy dole bludgers, even though the budget papers make clear that we don't spend much on the unemployed, let alone there's no evidence that that most of them are lazy dole bludgers. So when we think about the budget, we probably think about health and education and welfare, Actually, what the budget papers spell out is that military spending is very, very big. Expenditure on the unemployed is very, very small. And then, of course, there's climate change. Now, the word climate change did get mentioned in the speech this year, which arguably means it's better than some, or perhaps it just suggests that, you know, the coalition's polling is showing them that climate change does matter, and it would have been they would have got in more trouble ignoring it than superficially mentioning it. There was no real new money in the budget for climate change. One of the existing climate funds, ARENA, there was an announcement that in the budget that some ARENA funding would be going to a microgrid. That's good, but you know, it wasn't new money. It just was a new project that was going to be funded out of existing funds. Now, no matter how hard you look through the budget papers, and anyone that's ever kind of worked at an NGO or a company, when you kind of write up your budget, it's kind of up to you what categories to sort of lump things in and what to call the categories. As I said before, we don't say military spending, offensive weapons, defensive weapons. We just call it all defence. That's nice. We can call it whatever we want. There's no line item in the Commonwealth budget called fossil fuel subsidies. That's because they don't want people to see how many of them there are. But my colleagues at the Australia Institute have gone through the Commonwealth budget, have gone through the state budgets, and last year in Australia, governments in Australia spent $11 billion, $11,000 million on fossil fuel subsidies. But, you know, this isn't in the budget papers. That doesn't mean the money's not buried in there somewhere. It just means the way they've categorised things in the budget papers makes it hard to find. So it's easy to find total amount spent on health. It's easy to find total amount spent on the age pension. It's really hard to find total amount spent on fossil fuel subsidies, because according to the government, they don't even have any. They just have industry assistance for the oil industry and exploration assistance for the gas industry and infrastructure support for the coal industry and blah, blah, blah. So just like the decision whether to have a State of the Union address or a budget is a political decision, it's also a political decision how we categorise things, how we put them together in the budget. Now, to the government's credit, they have started to republish a women's economic statement, a kind of summary of the budget for what measures they've announced for women. This is not a new idea, but the coalition stopped doing this at some point, mainly because it was getting so thin it was a bit embarrassing. But again, that's the point. The way we structure the budget papers draws people's attention to what's in there and what's not. So at least, as I said, like mentioning climate change in the budget, of course it's cynical, but it shows they're under pressure to do something. Reintroducing the women's economic statement is sort of proof that people are paying close attention and demanding more from them. So that's a good thing, even though there really wasn't a lot in the budget for solving the fundamental inequalities that we can find in Australia. You know, there's everything from the design of the income tax system, the design of the superannuation system, to the fact that while Australia charges a lot of money to go to childcare, it's free in a lot of Nordic countries. All of these choices have a big impact. All of these budget and government choices have a big impact on the gender pay gap in Australia. But whether or not the budget papers focus people's attention on that or seek to conceal it, that's a political choice. It's why who is in government matters. So I'll wrap up in a few minutes, but I kind of can't talk about budgets and things without talking about deficits and debt, purely because they get people so excited. Again, we've got plenty of time for questions, and there's always hairs to split on these things. But the big picture thing to understand is that in any time period, let's take 12 months, it's arbitrary, but let's go with 12 months, if in a 12-month period an institution or a person spends more money than they receive, then from an accounting point of view, we call that a deficit. Now, an NGO can have a deficit, an individual can have a deficit, a government can have a deficit. It's merely an accounting. It's merely an accounting word. Where people get a bit confused, and actually I should put that another way, where people have been deliberately confused by politicians and business leaders and commentators for a long time, is that a lot of people think that a government running a deficit is like a company running a loss. And for a community, a society that's sort of as neoliberal as Australia, we think profit good, loss bad. I'd rather a company make a profit. It seems like it's a good company that can keep going than a company that's making a loss. That sounds like it's bad and unsustainable. But from an accounting point of view, and that's getting pretty exciting now, I can imagine, let's see, no, everyone hasn't dropped out yet, that's good. From an accounting point of view, a deficit and a loss are entirely unrelated concepts. I'm choosing my words carefully here, entirely unrelated concepts. So I'll give you an example. If a big mining company, take BHP, spent $10 billion this year building an enormous new mine somewhere, $10 billion. And because it spent $10 billion in 1 year building a big mine, it ran a deficit, right? It spent more building stuff and spent more on staff and costs than it got from selling iron ore and copper and coal. So it spends $10 billion building an enormous mine. The consequence is that it wrote more checks than it received. So it's in deficit this year. No accountant would describe BHP as making a loss that year. Because when you spend a big lumpy amount of money on something like a mine, or if you in your own life spent money buying a house or a car, or your kids went to uni or whatever, when we sort of spend money on things that will deliver lasting benefits, no accountant looks at the total amount of money spent and treats it as if that only matters in the year that it was spent in. So from an accounting point of view, when we invest in things that deliver benefits in the future, we kind of chop that investment up into little bits. We use something called depreciation. We can talk about this a bit if people really want. But the main thing to understand is that just because you spent more money than you earned doesn't mean you're being irresponsible. It's when companies do it, their shareholders don't panic, their accountants don't panic, their boards don't panic. As long as the money's getting spent on good stuff, that's fine. Similarly, like if someone earns $100,000 a year and they buy a $600,000 house 1 year, then they've run a huge deficit that year. They've obviously spent more money than they earned. But if over the life of that house, people think, well, you're going to save more in rent than you're going to spend on interest and the value of the house might go up, most people don't think borrowing money to buy a house is in some way reckless or irresponsible. And similarly, when we send our kids to uni, everyone thinks that nearly everyone thinks sending your kids to uni, if they're into it, is a good idea. Well, any kid that's at uni working at McDonald's earning $20,000 and spending $20,000 on food and rent and another $15,000 on their HECS fees, any kid going to uni is clearly running a deficit. But we're so unworried about kids running deficits that it's the government that lends the money through the HECS scheme to go to uni. So when we tell young people to spend more than they earn to go to uni, we tell most people if you can afford to buy a house and borrow a lot of money, you should. Companies borrow money all the time. That is, they spend more money than they earn and borrow the difference because they think the things they're investing in will well and truly pay them for themselves in the future. But even though we know that individuals and companies borrow money because they're spending more than they earn every year, even though we know that all the time, whenever a government spends more money than it receives in taxes, we kind of panic and say, you can't run a household like that. Well, yes, you can. Or you can't run a business like that. Yes, you can. So to conclude, what we need as citizens when we're looking at government spending, when we're looking at the budget, is we need to think, but what is the government spending money on? Are the things they're spending money on going to deliver us lasting benefits? Because if our government is spending more than it's earning, or receiving, and it's spending more on things that we think, well, that's going to set us up well in the future, an educated, healthy population with good water and good energy and good transport infrastructure, right? If we're spending money on all of those things, that's great. There's no problem there. But we've kind of been trained in recent decades to think that if a government is spending more than it's earning, bad things are going to happen. But, and I'll wrap up on this point, this is the fun part. Now that the coalition have been in power when something unexpected happens, now that the coalition are in power when there's a big budget deficit, we're told we don't have to worry so much about it anymore. To be clear, we don't have to worry about the deficit. That's my point of view. But what we should worry about is what it's being spent on. Back to those priorities I talked about before. Because going into deficit, spending $11 billion a year on fossil fuel subsidies that will cause us harm, from an economist's point of view, I think that's absolutely crazy. But it's not the deficit that's crazy, it's what it's being spent on.
Thank you, Richard. We've got some lovely comments, people thanking you for explaining this in very clear language, because we know how people love to make it confusing when it really isn't, some of it anyway. So, Richard, we've got some terrific questions. I'll just start running through them, if that's okay. I've grouped a few together around climate change. So we've got about 3 questions on climate change, and then we've got a few others which are also excellent. So the first one is, back to climate change. You talked about the fact that it was mentioned in the budget. Can you give us a bit more detail what they actually focused on with climate change in the budget?
Oh, look, it was really just a glancing mention in a 20-minute speech. It got mentioned once, and that was to make the point that some money would be spent on a new microgrid to connect some renewable energy in remote Australia to some users. That's a good idea. I'm not opposed to that. But, when you understand that the government each year, and the Commonwealth government spends $630 billion, right? $630,000 million. That's how much money got spent. The fact that a couple of million went on a microgrid somewhere, well, to say it's a rounding error doesn't come close. But there's certainly no attempt by this government to integrate both the threats of climate change and the opportunities of reducing emissions into a coherent strategy for here's what we're trying to do as a country. The opposite. It was, here's some money for you, here's some money from you, and I better say the word climate change or people will pick on me.
Yes. Thank you. And should I say, with deep respect to our government, microgrids, remote energy for remote communities is an idea that's been in place for 32 years at least. So yeah, I visited them way back. Anyway, so Jenny has asked a great question. She said the latest IPCC report is out on mitigation, saying that we're not doing enough, obviously, to address dangerous climate change. What level of funding do you think would have been appropriate in the budget to focus on mitigation?
Well, it's interesting. See, mitigation, the first step is that we'd save $11 billion a year. Like, I hate to be the downer here, but Australia is not trying to reduce emissions. We're not. We never have, never, ever, ever, ever. We are opening new coal mines. We are opening new gas fields. We are subsidising $1 billion gas-fired power station in Kurri Kurri. We are giving money to the oil and gas industry to go and explore for oil and gas that couldn't possibly make it to market if we found it tomorrow. It couldn't be extracted and sent and sold for decades. So Australia's, let me just be crystal clear here, Australia's emissions from burning fossil fuels are rising. They are not falling. They're not flat, they're rising. We conceal the fact that our emissions from transport and energy and industry, we conceal the fact they're rising by generating carbon credits in the landscape and all this sort of stuff. And that's fine. Of course, we should grow as many trees as we could, but we actually need to stop increasing our fossil fuel production. We need to stop increasing our fossil fuel consumption, and we're not. So it's interesting, you know, how much do we need to spend to start mitigating? Well, step one, stop subsidising the bad things. And this is still heresy. In Australia, it's still like, you know, oh, people want to know how many renewable energy sort of, you know, or how much we should invest in renewable energy or something. Well, of course we should invest in renewable energy. But the first thing you do is stop expanding our emissions, stop opening new gas wells that leak methane, stop building new coal mines. So step one, stop doing dangerous stuff. Step two, stop subsidising doing dangerous stuff. Hasn't cost us anything yet. Step three, we should actually be doing everything we can to encourage energy efficiency all across the economy, whether it's in the design of our homes, the way we live in our homes, the design of our cities. Australia is one of the few countries in the world that doesn't have fuel efficiency standards for its cars. It's not an accident. So, you know, from a budget point of view, don't subsidise bad things. That will save us money, not cost us money. Step two, encourage energy efficiency in our homes, in our commercial buildings, in our shopping centres, in our industry, in our transport. Again, that's not going to cost anything in terms of writing checks. It's a behavioural change, a planning change. Hasn't cost us anything yet. And then after we've done those things that save us a fortune, if we want to put some money into renewable energy, great, get on with it, no problem at all. But we have to, unfortunately, in Australia, don't take this the wrong way, I'm glad we do a bit of subsidising of renewables. I'm glad we do a bit of subsidising of EVs in some states. That's all good. But we're so kind of drawn to the little good things we're doing that, that we pretend the big bad things aren't there. So how much should we spend tackling climate change? As much as it takes, which, by the way, is exactly the answer Scott Morrison gave when it was asked how much should we spend on nuclear submarines. He said, whatever it takes. He doesn't even have an estimate of the cost. He just knows that in order, to feel safe, he wants to have 12 nuclear submarines, and he doesn't even know how much they'll cost. Well, really, if we want to feel safe from climate change, we should spend a lot. But I don't know how much, and indeed, I don't think I need to know how much. All I need to know is we need to stop doing the bad things, stop subsidising the bad things, start doing the good things, and if the rate of improvement isn't fast enough, then spend more and do more. But we keep, and sorry to be Debbie Downer here, but we talk about how Australia is transitioning away from fossil fuels. We're not. We're transitioning towards fossil fuels. Right, we've just opened the first coal mine ever in far north Queensland in the Galilee Basin. A whole new region of Australia has just transitioned to fossil fuels. We've just we're building $1 billion subsidised gas-fired power station in Kurri, so we have to build a new gas pipeline to hook it up. And we're exploring enormous gas exploration in the Beetaloo Basin, for example, in the Northern Territory. So it's just not true that Australia is transitioning away from fossil fuels. We're still transitioning towards them. It's just while we're transitioning towards them, we are doing some nice things. And I'm not anti the nice things, but I won't stop seeing the bad things because we did some good things.
No, thank you, Richard. Excellent, honest answer. One more question linked to all of this. David's asked, what can be done to get the gas industry, I guess while we're stuck with it, to pay appropriate returns? And this links to corporate tax rates as well. He's indicated, how can we get them to pay appropriate amounts, either through taxes, royalties, the kinds of things I'm adding here that other countries like Norway have made a lot of money for their communities through the sovereignty taxes and such.
Yeah. Oh, look, it's simple. We'd have to elect a government that wanted to do that. And to be clear, state and federal governments, Labor and Liberal governments for decades haven't wanted to do that. You know, and there's something kind of pathetically colonial and insecure about this. Like the way Australia talks about the fossil fuel industry is always like, we have to be really nice to these big multinational fossil fuel companies. We need to offer them subsidies, or maybe they won't come. Maybe they won't give us their development, when of course we're giving them tens of billions of dollars worth of our natural resources, often for free. So to give you an example, Australia is now the largest exporter of liquefied natural gas in the world, LNG. LNG is methane that's been cooled and compressed. So if you've seen those giant boats with the big bubbles on them, that's liquefied natural gas. And we export more of that than anyone else in the world. It used to be Qatar. We overtook them in 2019. Qatar, the second biggest exporter of LNG in the world, collects 20 times more tax on LNG than we do. 20 times more tax than we do. So we export more gas than them. They collect 20 times more tax than we do. There's a specific tax that's specifically designed to collect tax from the oil and gas industry in Australia. It's called the PRRT, the Petroleum Resource Rent Tax, and it doesn't collect any tax. Like it's trivial, about $1 billion a year. Remember, Australia's $650 billion a year in spending. Well, 1/650th of that is collected from the PRRT. A couple of years ago, the government had an inquiry into why the PRRT collected bugger all tax, and the inquiry concluded, oh, it's working just fine. We agree it collects bugger all, but it's working just fine. So it's not an accident that we don't collect any tax from oil and gas. It's not an accident that we spend $10 billion a year subsidising it. This is because successive Australian governments, state and federal, Labor and Liberal, have made these choices. And as long as we keep making those choices, we're going to keep seeing Australia's greenhouse gas emissions rise, not fall, not stabilise, rise, because that's what's happening.
Thank you. Just capturing some of the other great questions. A really nice one that flows on from that is from Jack saying, what would you like to see $11 billion worth of money of Australian resources being spent on to support the environment? What do you think should have happened?
Oh, look, there's so many things, but, and again, I don't mean to reject the premise of the question, but I just have to say that we have to stop doing harm before it even makes a lot of sense to do the good, right? If you've been bitten by a spider and you ask me, how much does the anti-venom cost? It's like, well, are you going to, you're laying in a nest of spiders. I think I need to stop you being poisoned before we start trying to fix you. So I think the environment movement in Australia, you know, that's a big term, and there's no one way to describe all these people, but we kind of get sucked into saying, oh, can I have $1 billion to fix this bit? When in the context of all the pressures that bit's under, you know, what the hell? So, for example, like koalas, how do we stop koalas going extinct in my children's lifetime? Stop chopping down all the trees they live in. Right, that's it. That's how you save koalas, not chopping down koala habitat to turn it into suburban housing. But if you're going to keep allowing the suburban housing to keep getting built in the only places koalas can live, how much money could we spend trying to save the koalas? I don't know, as much as you want, but it's not going to work, is it? Because koalas evolved to live in particular areas, and the combination of climate change ruining those areas and us chopping them down equals a lot of dead koalas. So how would I like to see the 11 billion spent? Well, I'd spend 10 billion of it lobbying to stop all the bad shit from happening, right? Because if we keep letting all the bad things happen while we spend some money on some good things, end result's going to be the same. It's like laying in a bathtub full of poisonous things, hoping the anti-venom will help. But yeah, look, you know, I think So I would focus the money on paying people to stop doing bad things until we could change the law to make it impossible. So, hey, property developer that wants to make $1 million out of the real estate, here, have the money. Now, piss off. We're never, ever going to build houses in this last remaining koala habitat. But yeah, sorry to be so negative, but until we stop doing the bad stuff, I don't spend a lot of time thinking what would the good stuff look like.
No, Richard, you're spot on. And it's definitely an area that NENA and the Green Prince approach are constantly talking about, rethinking the very foundations of how we live and what we do so that we can stop doing the bad stuff and keep doing more of the good stuff. So the deep systems change work that we're all involved in, very important. Thank you, Richard. Now, a couple of questions away from climate and environment. One person, Tim, has asked, how quickly could the budget be reset by a new government post-election?
Oh, instantly. Again, if constitutionally, if you can get a majority of both houses of parliament to support your plan, we can implement your plan. So yeah, the timing has got everything to do with politics, not economics. So I'll give you an example. Australia is one of the lowest taxed countries in the developed world. According to pinko lefty organisations like the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank and the OECD, Australia is one of the lowest tax countries in the developed world. And countries like France and Germany, not to mention countries like Norway and Denmark and Sweden, collect far more tax than we do. And who cares about the tax? That's not an end in itself. And then having taken a lot of resources off wealthy middle-aged white blokes by making me pay more tax, then they use those resources instead of building a new bathroom for me or a new jet ski for me. In those other countries, those resources are deployed to have free childcare, to have free universities, to have much higher quality, often free public transport. Right? So other countries have got a radically different shape. We focus all the time about the size of one economy to the other, but the shape of a Norwegian economy is radically different to the shape of the Australian economy. We have similarities, educated, wealthy, lots of natural resources, but just like Australians spend more on coffee per person than almost anyone else in the world, the Norwegians and the Swedes spend far more on health and education than almost anyone else in the world. These are choices that matter. And choosing to collect more tax and choosing to have more public services radically reshapes the economy. And that's a democratic decision. I don't want to move to Norway. I like Australia. But personally, I wish Australia would reshape its economy in ways that are very successful in other countries. But most Australians have been told if we collect more tax and spend more money on public services, we'll hurt the economy. Well, all the evidence says the opposite.
Thank you, Richard. And a linked question, Thomas has asked, given the budget's focus, do you think that it would actually make a difference to the outcome of the elections?
No. I think, if you work in the press gallery, if it's your job to report on the budget, of course you have to say the budget's important. But I don't think for most people it made that big a difference. The political analysts always talk about the government hoping to get a bounce out of the budget. History suggests that 2 weeks later, people can't remember most of it. Don't get me wrong, it is important. How we spend $630 billion a year, I think is really important, how we spend it. But unfortunately, we have a tiny debate about should it be 630 or 610, when really we should be saying, hang on, we're spending 630 billion and some people are eating gruel in aged care. How do we fix that now? So yeah, I don't think it'll make a big difference. Sure, the government's going to post some checks to people. Maybe that swings some voters. But I don't think anything that was announced last week will be the decisive factor.
Thanks, Richard. Got a couple of questions, and just to remind folks who may have joined us late, due to some changes in daylight saving and some time clashes, Richard's only actually able to be with us for another 5 minutes. I do want it on the record, though, that I had wanted him to stay on longer so we could grill him even more. But what I'm going to do is condense a few. Richard loves us. He'll be back. I'm going to squish a few questions together. So we've got a group of questions that are really excellent about Short-termism. People are asking, the current budget focuses on the very short term. Does it promise anything towards future benefits? How do we think about long-term politics when our budgets are such a short-term focus?
Right. Well, I'm going to disagree. We're about to spend $100 billion on some submarines that at best will not be delivered for 20 years. $100 billion to build some stuff that can't even potentially give us benefits for decades. So I understand why people feel this, but when we want to think long-term, we do. We are not stupid. We live in the 13th richest, biggest economy in the world. Our GDP is about the size of Russia's. We are in the OECD. We are in the G20. We are in the Five Eyes Intelligence Alliance. Australia is a sophisticated world player with one of the biggest economies in the world, with one of the biggest military budgets in the world. We are capable of solving any problem we want, and ignoring any problem we want. So I understand people's sentiment to say, oh, we would spend more money on, public schools if only the government thought longer term. Well, that's nice, but it's not true. They think long term when they think about their agenda. They've been thinking long term when they've spent enormous amounts of money on tanks and planes and submarines. There's been a 20-year agenda to lower income tax for rich people. There's been a 20-year agenda to privatise, right? To think that these people aren't thinking long term is to completely underestimate them. And that's why they win, right? So I get it. I see that the decisions they're making seem to conflict with what most people would think are good long-term decisions. But these people who've spent their life getting pre-selected into Parliament, getting elected into Parliament, clawing their way into cabinet to become Prime Minister, they've been thinking long-term about them for decades. And then when they're in, they're committing our country to defence and foreign affairs policies that will last for decades. So they can think long-term, and they do think long-term. It's worse than that. They just don't care about your priorities.
Thanks, Richard. We've actually got 3 sets of other questions, so we might move through them fairly quickly, then let you go. A quick one. A number of folks have asked about MMT, modern monetary theory. Do you think Australia should adopt MMT economic theory?
Look, I did a whole webinar on MMT with a woman called Stephanie Kelton. So if you want kind of my thoughts on that, feel free. I don't think Australia can adopt a theory, right? To generously interpret the question, would it help our understanding of the options available to government if more people understood a bit more economics, including MMT? Yes, but Parliament doesn't pass theories. And theories don't inform what these people do. They don't need to agree or disagree with MMT to spend $10 billion subsidising fossil fuels. So modern monetary theory, I won't summarise it for those that don't know now, but the big picture is if a country prints its own currency, it can hardly go broke. And that's true. And plenty of economists, myself included, going back to Keynes and Lerner have agreed with that assertion for nearly a century now. So not worrying about debt and deficits and spending money well, yeah, sign me up. But again, parliaments don't pass theories. Parliamentarians don't have to agree with a theory. They have to act in a way that is going to solve the problems we care about. And who we elect determines which problems we solve. Which theories do or don't influence them? Well, often the only thing that influences them is their thoughts about winning the next election. That's what democracy is based on.
Thanks, Richard. There's one quick question about what's an ecologically rational approach to looking at population growth in Australia?
To look at population growth in Australia and to not ignore it and to have an honest, open debate about it. On the record for decades saying that I think telling ourselves that the bigger the population, the better our society and economy will be is silly. But I don't know what the right population is. I don't think any economist could say, oh, this is the right number. But I think we need to accept that when we put more people into a landmass, there are benefits and costs. And we've been trained to talk about the short-term economic benefits, and mainly in the form of more customers buying more stuff. And we're trained to look away from, you realise that's killing the koalas. So I'm not anti-immigration. I don't support zero population growth, but I very much support an honest, open debate that accepts that it's up to us how big our population is, and simply growing it so there's more customers at Bunnings seems crazy to me.
Thanks, Richard. So as we wrap up now and let you go into your next event, could you perhaps just summarise for us what you think the best things are that all of the committed human beings across Australia could be doing to have a very different looking budget next year?
Yeah, well, look, the first thing is to understand that Australia is one of the richest countries in the world, and despite COVID, we live at one of the richest points in world history. And this year, the government spent $630,000 million, right? And my one-liner is, we can afford to do anything we want. We just can't afford to do everything we want. And the purpose of a budget is to prioritise, and who we elect has an enormous impact on those priorities. So it's our job as citizens to not be scared and not be silenced and not be told, pat on the head, be nice to do those things, but we, quote, can't afford them. Whenever you hear a politician say we can't afford something, what you heard them say was, I don't want to, right? I want to do something else. I want to spend $15 billion on stage 3 tax cuts. I want to spend $100 billion on submarines. I want to spend $11 billion on fossil fuel subsidies. When someone says we can't afford something, all they mean is, I don't want to. I want to spend it on the things I like. And that's fine. It's a democracy. But we need to be honest about priorities rather than dishonest about can afford and can't afford.
Thank you, Richard. And can I just give a plug for the role of NENA in trying to bring more people into conversations about our economic system as one of the many tools to make a better society. So don't just think about voting, think about getting into power, think about influencing those who are running for power. And NENA will continue to try to bring lots of people together as we move into the next year to look at different strategies and maybe even a mirror budget from the community's point of view. So Richard, everyone, could you please give Richard a big thank you? We're sorry we don't have you a little bit longer, but we'll get you back very soon. Thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you. And thanks for everything that NENA does. And yes, please invite me back along. Apologies for my appalling daylight savings time management. And if people want to hear my rants, just follow me on Twitter or check out the Australia Institute. But thank you so much for everything you guys are doing.
Thank you, Richard. See you soon.
Bye.
Bye. So Richard's got to duck off, and just before we let him go, I just wanted to give some final comments to plug all the good things that the New Economy Network Australia is doing. So we are a network of individuals and organisations connecting across Australia, particularly on Zoom these days, but also through regional and local activities when we can and when COVID permits. This year, we've got a range of really cool things, and if you've not heard of NENA before, please visit our website. It's on the slide behind me, neweconomy.org.au. We have heaps of excellent free webinars lining up at the moment. Our fantastic short course called Building a Wellbeing Economy, Foundations for Learning and Practice is kicking off again on the 19th of April. And it looks at different ways of thinking about elements within our economy so that we can build something so much better. Other than that, please think of becoming a member and tune into any of the work we do. We are a cooperative, so anyone who becomes a member can instantly start creating their own hubs, activities, events, and bringing good things to others inside our network. Other than that, I shall sign off now. This recording will be available in the next few days. It'll be up on the website if you wanted to re-listen. And I really strongly suggest you, if you're interested in what Richard has to say, which I know I am, the Australia Institute's YouTube channel is loaded with fantastic material. So definitely go and check it out. So thanks everyone, and we hope to see you again soon at another NENA activity and event. Thanks everybody, and thank you Rhiannon for helping me. Okay, signing off.